All right, well, it really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I love these invitations where I get to go spend most of the time as a student because I really am learning a lot at this one, and it makes me very happy to be here. That said, we're in kind of trying times. If you've been watching the news, you might be a little down because of geopolitical tensions. You might be a little nervous that some experts say we're ticking closer and closer to doomsday than we've been in a long time through thermonuclear war. You might see that we're cutting back regulations in the United States on our clean air and clean water, and that new regulations are making things worse and worse. And that at the same time, we're cutting the cures at the NIH and the research in mRNA vaccines, which could be really wonderful going forward. All of these things may be bothering you. But if you've looked in the last 3 weeks, you see there's a much greater danger. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the current agent of doom. If you've been watching the news, you're probably scared to death of Fragaria ananassa, the strawberry. There's been a number of reports that have come out in the last few weeks, which are coincidental, strangely, that indict Driscoll strawberries right up the road here in Watsonville as being toxic agents of doom to you and your family. That this has been coming out, that there's that cause cancer, these are not words that we're using lightly here, that they cause cancer, that they're higher incidence of cancer in kids. This was circulating throughout social media. And it was hard to go anywhere online and not see this. This one was particularly telling. I don't know if you have, part of this came from a group called Mamavation, who Mamavation said that they are independent laboratory investigations into everyday products, revealing truths, and protecting futures. And their test was a good one. They bought 2 boxes of strawberries, a regular and an organic one, and they sent them off to some laboratory somewhere, and the laboratory gave them back a report. And they said they found, well, there wasn't a peer-reviewed study, they found trace levels of pesticides that were all far below legal limits. Trace amounts. And I work with analytical chemists. I'm not an analytical chemist, but we've identified genes associated with flavors in strawberries. And analytical chemists are amazing in that they can detect stuff on the edge of nothing. And that they were able to detect parts per trillion, parts per billion. A part per billion is a second in 32 years, 31.7 years. They could detect that with some compounds. And with that in mind, being able to detect trace levels, you would have to eat over 120 pounds of strawberries every day to reach a limit that was dangerous. But go back to those fearful messages. Check out this one if it works. It may not work because of the, well, the audio says, it's now been shown that you're going to die if you eat strawberries. Okay, that's what you would have seen if I would have done it. This one came out too. Also about Driscolls. So all 3 of these targeted Driscolls from independent sources. So, strange. This one was a report that said children in Santa Cruz County were more likely to have pediatric cancer, show incidence of pediatric cancers. And while the best number for pediatric cancer is 0, they were showing that there were higher cases in Santa Cruz County, where they grow a lot of strawberries for Driscolls. And these are all independent family farms that are contracted to grow for Driscolls. And they said there's 22.6 cases per 100,000 there, whereas the rest of the state, it's at 18.2 cases per 100,000. And you can see, those of you who work with statistics, see the problem with getting a fair accounting on very rare events. That when you're talking about 5 or 9 cases a year, that it's very easy to say, well, it went from 1 to 2, so it's doubled. Rare events are really hard to have accurate statistics on. And there are other counties in the state, like, what is that one? There's Humboldt County, there was Marin County, and Napa County, which is where they make the auto parts. Those were all higher. And this, again, was also not a peer-reviewed study. There's county data that were put together by an activist organization. And strawberries are grown all over the United States. And the same kinds of pesticides are used, especially in freaking Florida, where we live in the disease capital of the world for plants and people. And we didn't see the same kind of trends. And Driscoll's has records. They spray what's allowable and within the limits allowable, no problem. And so the big issue here was that these penetrating messages of how strawberries were going to inflict harm on you and your family have changed the opinions of many who are now showing videos of shoving strawberries down garbage disposals. And it all leads back to just a hint of what my topic will be today, is about disinformation in agriculture. And the reason this is so important is because we all like eating. And something that we still do very well here in the United States is produce food. We are sitting in an agricultural amazing place for agriculture here in the Central Valley. What is grown here feeds the nation. Yet there are so many organizations that want to change the way it's done or eliminate it altogether. And I really want you to, that's why I love this invitation. Think about this very seriously as a threat to our own food security and our national food security. Because if you think it sucks buying foreign oil, imagine when you're buying foreign food. And so I look at this as a vital place for us to understand the threats and understand the disinformation networks, understand the issues, and be able to push back against them. And that means all of us. So that's what we'll talk about today. So a little bit about me. Let me go with the thesis first here. Is North American agriculture is vulnerable, and that disinformation is a huge issue. Social media is the conduit, which is causing its demise, and there's very little resistance. And the last part is important, that disinformation is an existential threat to public health, food access, and national security, and it will hit the poor first. So this is why it's on my radar. So what's going on? Who am I and why am I here? I'm a scientist first. I'm a molecular biologist by training. Worked in all different systems from yeast to mouse to human to plants. And stuck in plants. When I came to Florida, they said they needed somebody to work in genomics, which was a new field at the time that I was working in. And nowadays I study genetics and genomics of flowering and dormancy, so when plants decide to flower. My colleague over here, Mujahid Hussain, is rewriting the book on dormancy in apples. I would do a really cool project in drug discovery from randomness. So where the rest of the world is going into artificial intelligence, I'm going into programmed ignorance. We're actually, because artificial intelligence, you learn only from what we already know. And what we're doing is using randomness to design molecules that universe and biology have never experienced before and see how they affect biological systems. It's awesome stuff. We play with light in vertical farms, and we're playing a lot with understanding why consumers dislike or like genetic engineering. And that's another part of what I do. But I'm also, I farm at home. I'm married to a farmer. She grew up in Ukraine on a farm, came to the United States in the 90s and hated every job she had. But she went back to farming. And so we are at farmer's market every Saturday. We grow fruits, vegetables. We do pigs and poultry. She's an artisan sausage maker. And we started our own breeding program a couple of years ago where I became a new old dad kind of out of the blue, which was super cool. And then it happened again. And yeah, it's not happening anymore though. So that took care of that. But we have a little retail farm store on the farm, and we live in the middle of nowhere. So we're a community access point where people who don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables can come to our place. The best thing they can get other than that is a moldy banana at the stop and go, you know. And so we really are a good place for people to come get access to fresh stuff, which is really, really nice. And I also have a background in communications, and I do a lot of consulting with companies in communication, strategic communication, which around certain issues, and that's a lot of fun too. And funding is all freely disclosed. I had one industry grant from Bayer Crop Science in 2017 for 1 year. They funded the Random project, And I hired a postdoc for a year, and then they bought a company and had to pay legal bills, so then they dropped me. So, that's my. So I also teach a class, which really ties in with this. I teach information literacy in medicine and agriculture. And what's so cool about this class is we teach all the tenets of critical thinking, but we use medicine and agriculture as the punching bag. And the reason that's so effective is because we can teach it around scientific principles that are a little more black and white and much less gray area than some of the emotional or opinion-based political issues that can be out there. We teach it using science, and we use science to show how people are fooled, how we expose our biases, how we understand the mistakes we make. And we go through media literacy and how we vet a scientific claim online. And we watch scientific claims morph from a scientific paper to an article written by the university communication to social media, and watch how the message changes. And it's really, really a fun class. It is buoyed by experts who come in as guests. And you might recognize some of these folks. It was Melanie Teresa King, Andrea Love, Dr. Schuyler Corbin, Schuyler Johnson, Dan Wilson, Jonathan Howard, and Britt Hermes. All of them have participated in the class, and all my course reviews say, more guests, less Folta. And I think that's really, yeah. And they just adore these. And just the number of students who flip their views based on words by Schuyler Johnson, Andrea Love, and Britt Hermes are just you would not believe the reviews I get on this course. And I'm so grateful that none of these folks tell me no, because they're such a cornerstone of the course. So let's talk more about this disinformation. How many of you have seen the Dirty Dozen? I see this thing every year. Everybody? So this Dirty Dozen list comes out every year for the last 30 years. And every year it makes me cringe. Because what this is doing is raising a sense of nervousness and fear of perfectly good food. And they come out with this list, and they rank produce by pesticide residues. And they say these are dirty and these are clean, but they used to only do dirty. And these infographics, they go everywhere. The news media is all over this. And it gets on all the big news channels. It's absolutely horrendous how this information penetrates and what it causes in terms of social phobia. How do they get their numbers? Do they test all the fruits and vegetables? No, you do. What they do is they take USDA data. So the USDA sends people into the field at tremendous cost. In over 600 sites, 10,000 items, they survey to ensure that pesticide levels are being followed, that the limits imposed by the EPA are being respected. And they show invariably that your food is really, really safe. They show that levels are extremely low. 45% of produce has non-detectable levels. Others are all below the standards. It shows that with just about all examples that your food is safe. And then this group goes and says it's not. How do they do it? What they do is they pool all the data. So if they found a trace of a pesticide in Watsonville, California, and they found a trace of a pesticide in Plant City, Florida, and they found a trace of a pesticide outside of a farm on Ithaca, New York, and they found another one outside of some city in North Carolina, they would say, there are 4 pesticides on a strawberry. They also don't pay attention to the quantity. They say that that they're there, and they conflate detection with risk. And so even though these levels are vanishingly small, that can't be physiologically relevant, they still say there are 4 there, and 2 of them are known carcinogens. So this is how they skew the messaging. And man, does it work. One of the things I showed you earlier, that it said, like the video, it said there are 371 pesticides on a Driscoll strawberry. It's like, I don't think there are 371 pesticides. So anyway, so they skew this. The other thing they do is that when they do use data to imply quantity, this has always been one of the big criticisms, that they'll quantify a specific, like one that is present at a higher level, and even though the USDA or EPA levels are significantly higher, they make up their own threshold. They say, well, we think this threshold should be lower. They compare it because California makes up their own thresholds too, which is fine. But they'll make them up even lower than California standards. So they manufacture risk by misinterpreting USDA data to scare people away from fruits and vegetables. Now, what's the problem with that? We're not eating enough fruits and vegetables as it is. That 80% of Americans are not getting enough fruit or enough fiber, 90% are not getting enough servings of vegetables. And so there's a big problem here in that you've got people scaring people away from nutrition that they need to be getting. But yes?
What's their motivation for doing that?
Yeah, their motivation appears to be dollars and cents. They're an organization that raises money to do this, and they get great penetration every single year.
But why would the organization want to do that?
I don't know. I think their main motivation is that they're driven by, they get tons of funding from the organic industry, which they're trying to get people to change to organic produce only, which I have tons of respect for organic farmers. It's tough growing things organically, and I have friends who are outstanding at doing it, but I can't do it. We can't, the things we grow, we have to use conventional pesticides on things like peaches because there is no organic equivalent. So that may be their big motivation, is to encourage the shift away from conventional produce, more towards organic produce, which costs more, bigger profits for farmers because it is a lot more labor to do it. So that appears to be their motivation. Yeah. Again, these are all things that are safe. When you look at the USDA evaluation, all of these compounds come in at very safe levels. So, whereas we look at the issues that are confronting farmers, one of the biggest problems is probably the access to the internet. And the fact that anybody can get online and disparage food and farming and do it in a compelling way, and that some organizations are making money doing it. And that is something that is a problem. And that this disinformation is not only really manifesting as changing consumer choice, it's changing dietary access, it's changing food access for the food insecure, it's changing public policy. And that's why I can stand up here today and say this is a problem that's on the horizon that we really need to think about and participate in turning around. American agriculture is fragile. And although we like to think of this as this, sturdy backbone of the states, it's huge capital to get in. You see consolidation happening all the time. Farms are going out of business. Last year, 46 bankruptcies went up 46% in 2025, and 156,000 farms gone since 2017. We see a rise in what they call the final crop, which is the crop of homes that show up on farmland that we aren't making any more of. And this is, again, is a huge threat. In Florida, we have 1,000 people a day move to Florida. And perfectly good farmland is being converted to subdivisions and amenities to take care of those folks. So this is really an issue for those of us who are close to farming, either from the university side, land-grant university side, or by participating in agriculture ourselves. So the other big problem is that farmers aren't getting any younger. The average age of the American farmer is 58.1, not being dragged down by lots of 22-year-old farmers. The 39% are over 65. We see weather is really a problem. We lost a fortune this year because of one night of a snap freeze that killed 58 citrus trees that were in the ground for years. It's thousands of dollars of loss there, plus what fruit that we won't see for 7 years. Decreasing use of availability of water, foreign competition, the lovely tariffs that'll happen on exports and imports. We see low commodity prices for our big agronomic crops. Labor shortages are really a problem, and policy gridlock. We're seeing a lot of things happen in agriculture which are really negative. and really imperil our ability to produce food going forward. And then on top of that, we have social media, which is spreading false information. And all of this is really raising a lack of trust between the consumer and the producer. And that's the problem with disinformation. I don't have to talk much about Kahneman into this room, but the reason it works is because, and this is what took me forever to figure out as a scientist, is that when you're working with the public, that facts don't matter too much, that it really is a question of who they trust, that when you're giving messages about poison in your food or issues like that, you're appealing to that system one thinking, that limbic system, emotional thinking, that's driving people to make snap decisions that are precautionary, that protect their family. If it's even a 1% chance there's something in the food, I don't want it. Versus me who says, yeah, but it's parts per billion and there's probably none. Look at figure 5 over here. If you look at this and you look at the method of exposure is dermal, not inhaled. They don't care about that. They just care about protecting their family. Good for them. But this is why these campaigns are so effective. And it's because it appeals to that reptile brain. The other big problem that's happening is just the lack of literacy towards agriculture and how it works. They're leveraging single studies that are one-off reports, sometimes looking at these trace residues, as I mentioned before. It ignores what we know about toxicology and pharmacology. It penetrates social media very quickly, and the red one down here says drives precautionary decisions that really harm the food insecure and arrest new technologies that could help the food insecure in the developing world. And it breaks my freaking heart because so many things that we could have done over the last 30 years with genetic engineering that would have changed or saved the lives for millions of people that we were not allowed to do because of social license. And and it works because, and going to things we talk about in disinformation space, is that they exploit system one thinking. They're heavily relying on confirmation bias. They use social media and very little fact checking. They have agents who earn trust, who then disseminate disinformation that aligns with what they think and what they've heard before. There's a lot of misdirection. If they tell you that they're going to take the food dyes out of your Fruit Loops and make them healthy, fruit doesn't have 2 O's in it. What's the clue here, And so they're going to make them healthy. You're not paying attention to the fact that it's a gigantic bowl of sugar. So they're misdirecting us away from the real problem. And AI has been a particular problem in helping disseminate false information. And to be honest, all of these fearful claims are much more click-worthy than Egghead over here talking about how the metabolic pathways that generate the compounds that bring up flavor. It's all about the way that the consumer is being manipulated for these kinds of disinformation ecosystems. The other big problem is the gap between food production and food consumption. That a lot of consumers are really the experts, where those of us who do this are kind of considered to be the idiots. And I can show you a file full of social media messages where people just tell me I have no idea what I'm talking about, even though I've been talking about agriculture for a very long time and doing it for a long time too. But that's the other big problem. So where does this come from? So the next parts of the talk, I'll talk about where it comes from. And in this part, I kind of am going to do something I shouldn't do in this room, is make some statements that are hints and observations that aren't backed by lots of evidence, which is really kind of a no-no, right? But I think that what it is I think it shows these trends, and I think you'll agree with some of this. So let's talk about that first. First, wellness influences and grifters. There's a lot of folks out there who are trying to sell you an alternative product or a way to fix a problem that they create by convincing you have a problem with your food. The food babe, she hates me. She's FOIA'd over 100,000 emails of mine and documents of mine. I'm chapter 2 of her book called Feeding You Lies. There's a lot of folks out there in this space, whether it's Joe Mercola or Callie Means, a lot of folks using less than credible science to impugn the integrity of food and farming. And they're using a lot of false messaging to do that. For them, it drives clicks. It positions them as the savior that's going to help you get away from big ag and the big seed industry. And it's a massive business. They're talking $6.8 trillion. That the wellness industry is much bigger than the big pharma industry that they decry. And so it definitely is about making a buck. We have a problem with monetized ideological organizations like the Environmental Working Group, who does the dirty dozen. They make a living pushing fear, and other organizations do this as well. And they do this in areas of biotechnology in particular. The Organic Consumers Association is not about organic farming, they're about anti-biotechnology. So there's a lot of wolves in sheep's clothing here, and quite a few of them out in that space. The big thing that's in it for them, and for some of these, has been they've actually aligned themselves with the legal industries that now can identify these trace compounds and sue over them. And you're in California with Proposition 65, right? Where individual whistleblowers can go into a place and say, well, this is an alleged carcinogen, so we're suing Starbucks because coffee contains trace amounts of acrylamide. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are happening. And we'll talk a lot about this in a little bit with with one of my favorite herbicides. The new place where we're seeing this is in political factions and cultural movements. And I think this is where we fit the RFKs and others, that we actually see political movements, and whether they're the extreme left or extreme right, coming together in a strange way. That used to be that it was the extreme left that didn't like genetic engineering and vaccines, and now it's the extreme right together. So it's really an odd confluence there. But it happens because food is tied with identity, culture, and autonomy. So it's really there to motivate change. And by appealing to by politicians appealing to this, illustrates how important, how well it works. In my state, Ron and Casey DeSantis, the governor and his wife, commissioned a study of bread and how much of the herbicide glyphosate is in there. And those of you who've been watching the news, you know glyphosate has been the subject of many controversies. For farmers, it is the safest thing you can spray. For some people in social media, it's the agent of doom worse than a strawberry. And they commissioned this study, which wasn't really a study. What it was they got a company to measure one sample from 10 different loaves of bread and came back with data saying, we detected it, and it's glyphosate is there 10 parts per billion. 10 parts per billion, 10 seconds in 31.7 years. And from that implied that your bread is no good, throw it out, it's poisoning you. And so now you've got politicians jumping on this same fear-based bandwagon. A big part of this is rage bait. So a big part of this is armies of bots. And this also comes up in the next level. When you post something online that says something positive about agriculture, or you put up positive information that is counter to a claim that's made, you are confronted with an army of comments and commenters, and this is on X, this is in Instagram, who have very limited numbers of followers, but have massive numbers, or sometimes small numbers, of replies. And they're all in response to some sorts of positive claims. I haven't quantified this, nor have I looked up the research that has, but I'm sure it's out there, and I will do that. But this is a great example. I did in 2023 a point-by-point refutation of RFK Jr.'s discussion with Joe Rogan about glyphosate, about the herbicide glyphosate. And I did a point-by-point podcast on Talking Biotech, which I've done now for 11 years. And immediately, and this is 2 out of probably 100 that took that screenshot of me and put something up there to take away from my credibility as a source against, it was that good, right? And they were all accounts that had virtually no followers or very few followers, who hadn't been around very long, but just accounts that didn't appear to be legit when you went through their content. The other one, and this is the one that was a controversial one, if you wanted to really harm the United States and you were an agent, like you were Russia or an adversarial country, Iran, whatever, you couldn't do it with missiles and bombs, but what if you could use the internet to break trust in its institutions? And there's a lot of folks who have claimed this is happening, and I don't want to be, conspiracy guy, but I think there is plenty of evidence that this is happening on some levels, that Russia forever has been disparaging genetically engineered crops in many different media avenues. The points that they make are all there to divide, and we see this mostly through RT and other Russian media sources that have been disparaging American agriculture. A study that came out of Iowa State in 2018 identified, they were looking at English-based or English language Russian media, and weren't looking for a specific trend, but the trend emerged that they were really hitting American agriculture, and that was the main target. And so there seems to be a lot more of this going on in terms of foreign adversaries potentially using these bot farms. And the sad part is that all the stuff with the wellness folks, the political folks, and the motivated organizations are all playing into that. And so this is where a lot more study, I'm sure, will happen going forward. This is a good example of that. The page Bioengineered Food Awareness has it says here 300,000, but it's over 1 million followers. So 1 in every 300 people is subscribing to this. And it is nothing but garbage. It is nothing but disparaging information about biotechnology, and it's always driven by these open-ended questions like, what is biotechnology? What is bioengineered food? There are always these open-ended questions that are coming from low-value accounts. And you see this over and over again, and I would urge you to check it out because it's nothing but endless setting it up and then answering those questions with disparaging comments about technology. And the idea here is to garner the trust of somebody who's going by, who doesn't know what to trust, and then finding moms and independent voices saying this is dangerous. And it's very compelling. And, and it's out of Morocco. So when you go to look up the admins, it's out of Morocco and anonymous, of course. So it's and I really love this group. I'm always being educated. And this is a great example of how this is manifesting in a place like Facebook. So last thing, the next part of what I'll talk about, what time we got? What time am I on? Till 12:15? Okay, good. I thought it's only 10 o'clock. I got a long time. I can't tell the longhand and the shorthand. I'm looking at what? I got to slow down. So what we'll talk about to wrap this up is some examples of the disinformation campaigns. And what I would really like to do is provide you a basic toolbox of what the information says online, what the reality is, and maybe ways that you can integrate into the discussion. And that's what we'll wrap up with. So the first one we'll talk about is genetic engineering. And this has been an area I've studied since I was 10 years old. I took the first book out in recombinant DNA technology of Downers Grove Public Library when I was 10. And I fell in love with this idea that you could take a gene from a human, a little piece of DNA, and stick it in bacteria and make human insulin. I mean, I've been in the field ever since. And what we've done in genetic engineering in plants is essentially engineer in 3 major traits. You're either resistant to larval insects, which is one trait, which has been great, cuts the amount of insecticide that's sprayed. You're resistant to an herbicide, which is generally thought of by agriculture and science to be a very low toxicity herbicide, and antiviral trait, which has really been used in things like papaya and squash. But in general, there's only 4 things, surprisingly, that are genetically engineered that enter the human food supply on a regular basis. And that's what comes from corn, soy, sugar beets, and canola. And it's the oils, the solids, the starches, the carbon backbones that go into things like xanthan gum. These are all high fructose corn syrup, glucose or table sugar from sugar beets. They're the ingredients that go into food. They're the ingredients in ultra-processed foods. These are where these ingredients go. So you're not eating necessarily soybeans that are genetically engineered. You're eating products that come from them. The vast majority of that goes to animal feed. About 70% goes to animal feed. quite a bit of it goes towards fuel manufacture for corn, ethanol. So there's very little of this actually does get to the human diet, yet if you go to bioengineered food awareness, they're talking about tomatoes and wheat and all these other things that are not genetically engineered. And when I'm talking about genetically engineered, I'm staying away from the term GMO because I don't like it. Everything that's not a clone is genetically modified, right? Anything that's not a direct clone is genetically modified, is different from its predecessors. So as we breed, as we mutate, as we do other changes, we're creating genetically modified organisms. So I want to stick with the precise language. So we're doing genetic engineering. And it's also important for this room to maintain that terminology. As my former grad student said, would you rather drive across an engineered bridge or a modified bridge? So, very important. And what's important to keep in mind is how good this technology has been. The number of health claims that can come from it in 30 years of use is 0. We have never seen an association with negative human impacts on human or animal health. And the fact that trillions of animals have eaten this over the last 30 years matters. Environmental concerns, because as you use the herbicide or this anti-insect gene over and over and over again, you begin to see resistance building to it. And that's a major problem, especially because the number of weed species is way off this chart. I mean, it is really becoming a problem in some places. And also concerns about consolidation. You get good technology and only a few hands that can use it really does affect the price for farmers and the dynamics in the field. And the good news is some of the new technologies, this CRISPR-Cas gene editing stuff that we're doing, is really democratizing the technology in a very good way. So these are the major concerns. So it's not without concerns, but it's not human health. But if you look online, you still see disparaging comments, and there's people who are making a buck off of this. Jeffrey Smith's been in business selling books and movies and stuff for 20 years, and he has no special training in science or agriculture, but the guy who runs these workshops and the non-GMO project is still putting labels on things that they'll put it on canned asparagus, even though there never was genetically engineered asparagus. They put it there because the asparagus company can pay for it. You know, it's a money-making scam. So this is still going on. The biggest problem we have are probably legacy claims. And if we go back to 2012, you might remember this image that still appears on web pages, social media, on posters at rallies. The 3 big lumpy rats, remember this one? This is the one that stopped the technology, biotech in Kenya. It stopped it in other countries, dead in its tracks because of this paper in 2012 that was retracted in 2014. But what this claims to show are 3 rats. It's got one that ate GMO corn over there on the end there. The next one had GMO plus the herbicide Roundup. The next one just Roundup alone. A couple of things about this. What are they missing? The control. What about the rat that didn't get any of the above? Well, if you look at table 2 in the same paper, it got lumpy too. But they didn't show it here because if they show it, it takes the air out of the balloon. And these are Sprague-Dawley rats, a kind of rat that is a cancer model that over 2 years, 77% will have tumors. And this was after 2 years. The other big issue with this is that, so not only was it set up for the photo op, is that this is a question of animal husbandry, that if I did this in my lab and let an animal go to that point, my lab would be shut down, I'd be fired. Yet this was tolerated. And then this paper was published again in a different journal, exactly the same 2 years later, and is still cited as a cornerstone of how this is dangerous technology. So this is more of what we're up against, is the legacy literature. The big problem is who cares? What's the harm? Well, farmers can lose good technology. We cease to get technology into the field. We still are using technologies from the 1990s with very little new innovation. Even though we've done it, the regulation to get it deregulated is massive. So that's a real problem. We would go back to broad spectrum insect sprays and tilling if we lost these technologies, which would be a real problem for the environment. The thing that breaks my heart is the bottom. And when you go to the developing world, they say, well, why should we have it if it's not good enough for you? Why should we have to have it? If your people don't want it, why should you force it on us? And I did some work in Uganda to work with the Minister of Science and Agriculture there to help him, he's a medical doctor, explain to Parliament why this is important. And we won, we got it, the president vetoed it. They have biotech crops in that country that will help alleviate vitamin A deficiency in children. We've had golden rice for 30 years that would help alleviate some level of vitamin A deficiency, which is still a huge problem. We have genetic engineering solutions for iron, for zinc, but that's all stopped dead in its tracks because of false information. That is why this matters. Seed oils, good times. So here's, if you read online, you'll read that these are industrial lubricants that are full of toxins and causing metabolic destruction, heart disease, and chronic inflammation. And Dr. Labos can chime in on this if he likes. But when you see experts defending seed oils, they're lying to you. And I could play Vani Hari here, but that's audio's not working there. But what's the story on this? And so seed oils are generated from seeds, obviously, and it's mostly corn, soy, cotton, and canola. Mostly corn and cotton and soy, or I'm sorry, corn, soy, and canola. And what this is really, in my mind, a proxy for genetically engineered crops. If you can vilify the products from them, you can cut the demand in them. People have, they have disaster fatigue about genetically engineered crops. They've been hearing for 30 years about how it's going to kill us all, and it hasn't done it yet. So let's shift from the crop to the oils that come from them. And so there's really a proxy. And you see this throughout social media now, and a lot of wellness peddlers talking about how dangerous seed oils are, and how we need to be switching to butter and ghee and tallow, to saturated fats. And what the literature shows is that that's a really bad move, that you have more problems from saturated fats than you do from these unsaturated fats, especially some of them, which appear to be even cardioprotective. So this is where now we're telling people through social media to get rid of the thing that's better for them and shift to this other, which has more negative health impacts. And that's really the problem, is that now we're switching to something that is not as healthy, just based on false information and the conduits to disseminate it. The long-term problem is consumers lose choice, they potentially pay higher prices if we stop making if we stop getting oil from genetically engineered crops, a switch to unhealthy fats, higher cost for health care, all the other issues that would travel with that. Glyphosate, so we'll talk a little bit about this. And this is the herbicide that is in the genetically engineered crops. In glyphosate, the picture is beautiful because it shows how it's used. You plant your crop and you let it start growing along with the weeds. Then you go over the top and spray. You kill the weeds, you keep the crop. And then the crop shades out the weeds. So you're not spraying it on corn, you're spraying it on the little plant once it emerges. You're not spraying it on a corn cob. And it's 90% of corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets in soy in North America. No evidence of a solid link to cancer from dietary and occupational exposure. We'll talk about that. And we understand the environmental risks. You don't use it around water. It can have tremendous effects on aquatic communities. And it works on one enzyme which humans don't have. So it inhibits an enzyme that's required for amino acid synthesis that plants have, that humans don't have, and some bacteria have it too, but that's why it has such low toxicity. The acute toxicity is higher, the acute toxicity is lower than table salt or caffeine. It's very, very low. The problem is that there were a few studies back in the early 2000s that showed slight correlations with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And these were case control studies, so they weren't very powerful studies where farmers were filling out essentially questionnaires recalling what herbicides they used and the diseases they developed. And there were some slight associations with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that were taken very seriously. But upon doing more higher resolution studies using cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, you were able to show that there were no associations. The best study of 54,000 applicators over 20 years shows no association. Yet, law firms key off of those original reports to initiate these massive lawsuits and around non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The big problem is that they win jury decisions because it's very easy to go into a courtroom as a very skilled attorney and convince 12 people who are non-scientists that, what do the scientists know? This poor guy over here needs compensation from the big bad company. And that's a very relatively easy argument to make. And they win some, they lose some, but these cases are ongoing and really do imperil ultimately farmers' availability to this kind of technology if they become, if they continue to win those cases. So what they ended up doing, what I should mention is that there's a lot of websites that are claiming to detect it. I think that was it. Yeah, that's the one from Florida that claims to detect it in bread. And they find it in parts per billion. So 18, 400 parts per billion, still just on the edge of nothing and far below any type of physiological relevance. A really nice example of that is, and this is where they conflate the idea of risk with detection, and we're really good at detection. But here's this explodes in social media. Here's a good one here in the middle on the bottom. It says at the end that you should read about the Dunning-Kruger effect. I teach about that, yeah. I should read about it. Yeah. I thought this room would appreciate that. And then lots of other weenie words where they say it's linked to cancer. Well, yeah, it is linked because that 2003 study from DeRusse et al. Showed this slight association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that was later shown not to fit with higher resolution, larger studies. But that link is there, and they'll continue to use that word, linked. The thing I'll show on glyphosate, the big problem was that in 2015, based upon a very controversial decision and very low amounts of data, suggested that this was a probable carcinogen. And there was lots of other political weirdness around that too. Some of the folks who made that decision would eventually become paid expert witnesses in these cases. So there's a lot of weird edges on this. And the lawsuits have been massive. People have made millions on these lawsuits. There's a really nice article I wrote with Andrea Love and Nicole Keller. Dr. Keller is a pediatrician who farms, and that was in Skeptical Inquirer back last year. So check that out if you have other questions. But the idea that they called it a probable carcinogen is a hazard-based assessment, not a risk-based assessment. When a hazard-based assessment says, which is what IARC does, is at some level, is there any evidence that it could potentially cause cancer? And they could show in some studies, very small number, that there were changes in DNA when you flood a petri dish with the stuff at a high concentration. And then some animal studies that under some conditions and long-term feeding studies with high amounts showed some potential neoplasias. And with those data, we're able to get that classification of probable carcinogen. At dietary and occupational exposures, it has never been shown to be a carcinogen. That's over 50 years of evaluations by dozens and dozens of regulators all over the world. And that's that slide. But this is a fun one. Okay, so a glass of GMO wine, anybody? This crap is killing us. That there's allegedly glyphosate being detected in wine at 50 parts per billion, which leads me to the final conclusion of 50 parts per billion of an IARC class 2A probable carcinogen is contaminating your glass of a beverage containing 130 million parts per billion of a class 1 known carcinogen, ethanol. But it really shows, doesn't that just show our misplaced sense of risk? We know alcohol causes cancer, okay? I love the stuff. I had a glass last night, it's great. But, but you look at risk and benefit. 130 million parts per billion, and I'm not worried about it, but yet people are freaked out about 50 parts per billion. It shows the misplaced risk and how we maybe need to incorporate that in our discussions. I want to fly through the last bit here. You can buy lots of compounds online that will protect you from it. There's nothing that any of these can do. It's all BS, but it's expensive BS. So let me zip ahead here to a couple more examples. I don't want to run out of time. So appeal. This is another one that's really a sad story. This was invented by a small company who knew that we lose 50% of our produce to food waste, that it's because of a loss of moisture and interaction with atmospheric gases. And the idea was if you could come up with natural compounds that would coat the fruit and limit that exchange, that would be a real benefit. And since it's natural, people won't care. Yeah, well, problem was Bill Gates funded a grant for $100,000 in 2012. And so when you read online, all you read is that Bill Gates, this is his way to control the food supply and destroy food, is because he controls this with appeal. And they found in the original patent that you would extract these compounds with some rather nasty compounds that were residual. They don't do that now, but because they did, they can communicate that this is poison. And the problem is now is that social media is basically driving this really well-meaning company out of business. And their communication strategies have changed a little bit. We've done some things to tweak that, but it definitely is a challenge for this small company to push back against social media, especially when this is a product that could help consumers and the food insecure. Seedless fruit get a lot of heat in social media. Time-wise, I'm not going to zip through. I'm not going to talk about that. Other than people are telling you that if you eat non-seeded fruit, you're. And one person even told me that they don't want a watermelon with Down syndrome because of the number of chromosomes that were present. And the problem is people eat fewer fruits and vegetables. I'd like to get to the end here. mRNA is another real big one that has been so successful in human medicine and is showing massive benefit in animal agriculture. And this is another heartbreaker. It's currently being used only in swine to prevent swine influenza, yet there are so many other places where this could have benefit. We heard about avian influenza last year and all the millions of birds that get bulldozed in poultry production. We have a vaccine for that, an mRNA-based vaccine that could work, but the chickens wouldn't be able to be sold, wouldn't be able to be exported to most other countries. So this is what limits it, so bulldoze the chickens. But this is, for anybody who likes biology, this is a great slide. All the people who are saying they don't want mRNA in their food, good luck. Yeah. And it's also affecting public policy. A number of states have now taken up policies that are fighting back against mRNA use in animals and livestock, even though this could be of great benefit to livestock farmers and consumers. And that's just a few examples. So just to kind of wrap up here, the real problem is that we've got 80% of people not getting enough nutrition. We've got cuts to public assistance that are limiting the access to fruits and vegetables. We've got too much screen time, not enough sleep, sedentary lifestyles, that we're seeing food deserts both in urban and in rural areas. We see all kinds of issues now with access to diagnostic care, and people are rationing their prescriptions because they're too damn expensive. We've got real problems to worry about, yet the disinformation distraction is really something that's stealing our attention. Ultimately, it affects many different areas that we're losing social license to innovate, and that's the big one. But there's a few other things that are listed up here as well. The solution is important, and the solution is inoculation. And I want you to identify who the experts are. Here's 4 who are up here now, but there's many others I didn't have time to grab. But these are folks who you can read their media in food and farming, and it really does help. But be part of that conversation. If you don't know the issues, identify who does and point to them. Or go to those sites and share some information. The idea is you're not arguing with the idiot who will never be teachable, the person who isn't interested in knowing the evidence. What you're doing is speaking to the person who doesn't know, who's reading that thread because they're trying to figure out who to trust. And do what you can to earn that trust. And this is a life and death thing. And we can talk about that another time. It's really bad in medicine and in cancer right now. people being talked out of biopsies, people being talked out of conventional first-line therapies. But participate in that conversation and amplify the folks who are really good. Share their stuff with your networks. It's really important. And with that, I'll wrap up there. Maybe take a question or two. So thank you very much.
I think we do have time just a question or two.
Yeah.
Why don't we get from here? Inspiring.
Question or two.
I've heard a lot about high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah.
Is there any health risks involved in that?
The question is there health risks with high fructose corn syrup? There is, because it's a sugar, right? And sugars we're getting too much of, and it's in everything. And the best thing we can do is limit our access to high fructose corn syrup, but also no more than sucrose, just table sugar, or glucose, corn syrup. It's just another way in which we're getting too much carbohydrate. Yeah, no, not necessarily more problematic than others. It's the amount. Questions, thoughts? Oh, no. All right, run over.
Are these like USDA and EPA levels pretending to be a level of safety, or just like the threshold of poison?
Yeah, so
Are you against further thresholds in different states than what EPA and USDA says for some of these things? It seems like you might.
No. So the thresholds that are determined are empirically determined based upon the minimal amount that causes an adverse event. And then they set the thresholds 100 to 1,000 times below that. So you're finding, here's where it causes a problem, we're going to go way below. Some states do have different, California does have different thresholds, but that's perfectly fine. Whatever those thresholds are, they are. But it's not the threshold where you see an effect, it's how much further below are we going as a margin of safety. And 100 to 1,000 times is usually pretty good. And they also vary for average person versus pregnant women or kids. Sometimes those will go even further.
Thank you, Dr. Folta.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it very much.